Happy Friday, everyone. John Lorden here with another episode of Brainscratch. Today's case is certainly a tough one. It is a cold case from way back in 1982. Keep in mind that is pre-DNA, and there's some interesting circumstances around this case that I think are locking up a lot of the information. There's not a ton of info out there. I have heard from a family member, and this is a case about a fallen hero, Robert Yesucevitz. So we're going to do our best to cover this. I truly feel like someone out there has some information, and I'm hoping just doing some coverage on this case might elicit some tips and help the FBI close this case out. But before we get into that case, I have a few updates I want to give you. I know we've had a lot of tough updates on the channel over the past few weeks, but thankfully, these are some positive updates. First, starting with the case of Verk. If you're not familiar with Zuzu's case, I will have the links to the original Brainscratch Searchlight in the description box below. This is originally a missing persons case. Unfortunately, turns into a homicide investigation. Thankfully, that investigation goes pretty well, and some people are charged, and that is what today's update is about. So over at foxnews.com from May 8th, updated on May 9th. A man convicted of murdering his girlfriend and burying her body in October of 2016 was sentenced to life in prison by a Central Texas jury. Robert Fabian, and this is a picture of him down here, 28, was convicted of murder and evidence tampering in the death of 21-year-old Zuzu Verk. A friend of Fabian, Chris Estrada, many of you that follow the case might remember that it seemed like Chris Estrada was helping Robert in some way when it came to getting rid of Zuzu's body. Chris Estrada also was arrested after cell phone and credit card records linked him to the purchase of the plastic sheets used to wrap Verk's body. During Fabian's trial, Estrada testified that Fabian had asked him for help moving Verk's body. Estrada said he declined Fabian's request, but told Fabian he would not turn him in. Estrada has entered a plea of no contest to tampering with evidence. A sentence for him is still pending. So we might have one more update to come out of all this yet. Another interesting twist that happened during the trial. A cellmate of Fabian's testified that the defendant told him Verk had found out about a sexual relationship between Fabian and Estrada and had threatened to expose it. The cellmate, Roy Roman, said Fabian told him that he had grabbed Verk's neck and didn't know if he broke her neck or choked her out. According to Roman, he would hear Fabian cry in the cell at night and say, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you." So very interesting information to come out during the court process. But of course, the best news, we have a conviction in this case. And even looking at this case from once her body was discovered, it was certainly looking suspicious in terms of her boyfriend being involved. Once again, the links are in the description box below. I don't want to completely rehash the story, but it does look like the evidence that we saw back then was pointing seemingly in the right direction, at least according to a jury that seems to agree with us. Moving on to our second update before we jump into today's case. This was an interesting, almost like a double mystery. We have someone, Dominic Potts, that goes missing, and we also have, I believe it is his great-grandmother, if I recall correctly, that is murdered very close in time, not on the same day, but within a matter of days. We do have an update in the case of Greta. Here's another picture of her. So let's jump over to Action News now. This is from May 4th, 2019. There has been a major break in the Oroville murder case of Greta Putnam, an 86-year-old grandmother who was killed November 8th, 2018 inside of her mobile home. Oroville police officers arrested 42-year-old Brian Scott Matting of Oroville for the murder. Evidence from the murder was linked to Matting, according to police. Unfortunately, I'm not finding any public information about what that evidence might be. I can tell you that I did speak to family members of Greta's. I've heard about some items that were left behind in the trailer. Some of those items could potentially have DNA, but I don't know if this was a DNA led them to him type situation. If you recall the story, which once again I'll have the links to in the description box below, there was some thoughts during the initial investigation that this might have been a homeless person because there is a church that does offer services to homeless people that is literally right next door to the trailer park. I don't know for certain if Brian Matting is homeless. The way that they describe finding him, they say officers found Matting sleeping in the grass in front of the Ampla Health. I think he might be homeless. We're also going to see a photo of him here. So it could be that story is lining up with the early investigators' assumptions. But family members do not know the man accused of killing their grandmother. Matting is being held on $1 million bail at the Butte County Jail. And here is a picture of him. So there is a little bit more of an update. He has had his first court appearance. Action News Now saw the suspect in the murder case of Greta Putnam break down sobbing in the Butte County courtroom. At Thursday's hearing, the defense requested more time before issuing a plea. Matting is expected to be back in court for arraignment on June 6th. Not typical that we hear this. Typically, pleas kind of come out quickly, and certainly not typical that we hear something like this where, the suspect is breaking down in court at this point. So I'll be curious to see what happens with this. But we do have an arrest. If this is that situation where this is a homeless person that took her life for some reason, the connection to Dominic's disappearance might not be there. This might be just a horrible set of circumstances where lightning is literally striking twice within the same family. I certainly had a hard time believing that when I initially looked into these cases, but seeing where these developments are leading us, we definitely have to consider that at this point. So let's go ahead and take on today's case, and we're starting here with an image of the JFK Presidential Library and Museum. And this is where our case takes place. So we're going to learn just a little bit about it. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum is located in Columbia Point in the Dorchester neighborhood town of Boston, Massachusetts. The building is the official repository for original papers and correspondence of the Kennedy administration, as well as special bodies of published and unpublished materials such as books and papers by and about Ernest Hemingway. The library and museum were dedicated in 1979 by 39th President Jimmy Carter and members of the Kennedy family. Interestingly, Kennedy was trying to get this library and museum started. There's a pretty interesting history. If you want to check the Wikipedia link, I'll have that down below as well. But this is a project that hit a whole ton of stumbling blocks. They initially raised enough money to do it one way, but then they had to change how they were going to do it. They needed a lot more money. It obviously took some time if it wasn't dedicated until 1979. The tragedy that we're looking at today happens only a few years after this in 1982. So let's jump to an article at newspapers.com. This is from the Honolulu Star Bulletin on the 21st of July, 1982. JFK Library Guard slain. A federal security guard at the JFK Library was shot dead last night, apparently while making an investigation outside the museum, authorities said today. It was his last week on the job. There is just a bunch of terrible circumstances you're going to see as we get into this story, but that's one of the worst ones. He was less than a week away from going back to college. And unfortunately, he wouldn't make it because of this occurrence. Robert W. Yesucevitz, 24, of Brockton, an officer with the Federal Protective Service Division, was shot once in the back of the head and was taken to Boston City Hospital, where he was pronounced dead just before midnight last night, said Michael Roper, hospital night administrator. So we're getting a little bit of detail on this. The gunshot is to the back of the head. There's some strange circumstances we're going to learn about the way his body was found, where his weapon was found, the fact that his weapon was discharged also. But let's move forward to a website. This is for the Massachusetts Law Enforcement Memorial Foundation. They have a page of fallen heroes. They have listed Robert on here. He had radio dispatched to report that he was checking on unusual activity in the rear of the library. After being unable to reach him again by radio, his backup officer found him with a single gunshot wound to the head and a round fired from his revolver still in his hand. Despite a massive investigation, no suspects were ever identified. Officer Yesucevitz had previously served as a military police officer with the United States Army. He was survived by his parents, 2 older brothers, and a sister. And essentially, it's a nephew that has reached out to me. He was very passionate about trying to get some additional coverage to this case. That's one of the reasons why I decided to take it on, though typically researching cases of this age is really, really hard. We have to lean on newspapers a lot more. And for this case in particular, there was pretty much national coverage at the time of his death. But in terms of subsequent coverage to cover the investigation, practically none. And that's because he is essentially a federal employee, and this fell into the FBI. So the FBI seems to have been really tight-lipped about this. It's interesting because sometimes I do see FBI-handled cases where they're pretty good about releasing details to the public, especially if they're trying to find more information. We don't have that going on in this case. I can't find, outside of the day that this happened, the information that his nephew sent me, and a few little tidbits I've kind of strung together from other articles on this, there's just not a lot of detail that's going on into this story. But we're going to continue with it and hope that the details we do have can elicit some tips and maybe motivate the right person out there that has the information to do the right thing and call it in. Of course, I will have contact information for the FBI in the description box below. So what exactly is the Federal Protective Service? Here is their website. Their mission statement is to prevent, protect, respond to, and recover from terrorism, criminal acts, and other hazards threatening the U.S. government's critical infrastructure, services, and the people who provide or receive them. Sounds like a pretty tall order for a mission statement. Let's get a little more detail. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., FPS is divided into 11 regions nationwide and is responsible for protecting over 9,000 federal facilities. They also provide responses to over 534,000 calls for service every single year. So that is the fine service that this man, Robert Yesucevitz, was working for when he was shot. Almost done working for, which is just such a heartbreaking aspect to this story. Let's jump over to another article at newspapers.com. This is from Rapid City Journal out of South Dakota. Just one little important point to make here. It was the first slaying of a protective service officer in New England since the founding of the department 11 years ago, according to Donald Kimball, a staff inspector with the service. And here there is a page, ODMP, where they have a profile on Robert, and they have, that's the Officer Down Memorial page. They have what are called reflections, where people will come by and just kind of make a post about him. And I wanted to share a few of these reflections and just show you that these have been going on. And you have law enforcement that's stopping by to pay their respects. We have family that is stopping by to let us all know how much they miss their fallen family member. And this is the most recent post here is September of 2018. So even though we're looking at a crime that happened back in 1982, there's a lot of people that are affected, a lot of people that still care here. And one of them is Derek. I miss you, Uncle Bobby. You are not forgotten by your family. After all these years, the memories are so vivid. It's not in vain. You will never be forgotten. We will not give up. Also, Jim posted a message here. Another year goes by with no rhyme nor reason for what happened to you. You were my uncle that I looked up to like an older brother. I still think of you every day, even after all these years. I miss you and will never forget. I'm really hoping that this episode of Brainscratch can bring this case back to light and at least memorialize Robert in some way as well while we're doing that, and just let his family know that there are other people out here that care about our fallen heroes as well. And I don't want to see this case just completely disappear. That's part of the reason why I want to share it with all of you. All right. This is an article. It looks like it was originally written for a newspaper. I believe it was written for the Globe in Massachusetts, but I found kind of a web reprint of it over at this website, thepuzzlepalace.com. A Federal Protective Service police officer scheduled to leave the service at the end of the week to return to college was shot and killed with his own gun last night while apparently questioning an intruder on the JFK Library property. So here we get a really strange aspect to this case. We're getting reports that he was shot and killed with his own gun. However, when they found him, we have reports that his gun was in his hand. We have reports that are saying the gunshot is happening to the back of his head. Is there some potential that we're looking at a situation where he might have taken his own life? We're going to hear from his family member with some more details before the end of today's video on that. The officer, Robert W. Yesucevitz, 26, of Douglas Road, Brockton, was found lying face down on the lawn off a service roadway near the ocean at the rear of the library with a bullet wound in the back of the head. Let me just jump to the map real quick so we can take a look at where we're looking at. So this is a top view of the JFK Presidential Library and Museum. And if we just pull out a little bit, you can see we've got the University of Massachusetts, Boston right over here. There seems to be some neighborhoods that aren't too far away. I'm seeing some references to kind of a projects area, which I don't think is being represented. I think these photos are too modern. I don't know exactly where that would be. But the way it's described, it could be where this now is a calf pasture is, because it's described as being kind of next to this. But the loading dock is actually back here. And that's the description that we're getting, is essentially he was found about 30 feet from the loading dock. So let me just drop us in back there so we can take a look. So you've got the grass right here, the seawall just on the other side of, there's a walkway. You can see the actual people walking there. And then of course we have water on the other side of that. Here is the actual loading dock. And there is this kind of driveway that comes around to the backside here. So somewhere around here is where he is actually discovered, and he was in a vehicle, so his vehicle is found here also. All right, let's continue back at the article. Lawrence Breda, a Federal Protective Service official, said Yesucevitz had been making his rounds at the library in his patrol car when he radioed his superiors. We received a duress alarm, which indicated he could possibly be having trouble, Breda said. We tried to contact him on car radio, but got no response. When the victim was found, his service revolver with one shot fired was found beneath his body, according to officers at the scene. So I'm primarily hearing two different descriptions for how his gun is found. Those are, one of them is that it's in his hand. The other is that it's under his body. It could be very likely that it's both. It could be that his hand is gripping it and he has fallen on top of it, so it is under his body effectively. A University of Massachusetts police officer on duty at the adjoining Harbor campus said there had been reports of an intruder in the area and that the officer had apparently located him and was questioning him when the shooting occurred. The FBI, Boston, and UMass police responded to the shooting scene and searched the area and nearby Columbia Point housing project. So that's the project that I was talking about that I believe it could have been here. There is a university parking lot here. It could be that this is where the projects were, that it was all part of this. But there are also apartment buildings over here. I don't know if the projects could have been renovated and turned into something there. But for what they're talking about, my gut's telling me it's probably one of these two or both of these areas here. But let's continue. Breda said Yesucevitz was in good spirits when he went on duty yesterday afternoon. So in terms of considering if he did want to end his life for some reason, we're at least hearing from people that work with him that he seemed to be in fine spirits. Jumping over to another article at Santa Cruz Sentinel, about 5 minutes later, officers who had been patrolling inside the building began a search for Yesucevitz and found him behind the library on the lawn near the loading dock about 30 feet from his patrol car. So that's one of the best descriptions that I could find for what they're saying. And interestingly, they're saying that he's near the loading dock, but about 30 feet from his patrol car, but we don't really know where his patrol car is necessarily. It could be right up against the loading dock. It could just be somewhere in this back area. And he is 30 feet from his car. Certainly sounds like a situation where he had met up with someone and could have been questioning them potentially. Obviously, something goes south. He has time to pull his revolver. There is a shot that's fired. Is it the same shot that kills him? Is it possible that there were more shots? Let's keep looking into this. Another article over at newspapers.com. This is probably the best narrative that I could find about what happened that night. So we're going to lean on this paper. This is the Boston Globe from the 22nd of July, 1982. On Tuesday night, only Yesucevitz and Arthur J. Donahue of Dorchester were assigned to the library that sits between the University of Massachusetts and the Columbia Point Housing Project. The routine Tuesday, as it was most nights, called for Donahue to monitor the library's closed-circuit security television inside the building, and Yesucevitz would patrol the 12-acre grounds in an EPS cruiser. The nearest backup police are at UMass and the Metropolitan District Commission's Old Colony Station, about a mile away. According to the official report read by Peter Thomas of the General Services Administration, which runs the Kennedy Library, this is what happened. At 10 minutes before 11, Yesucevitz radioed Donahue, Unit 29 to base, stand by. 3 minutes later, Donahue tried to call Yesucevitz. There was no reply. Donahue tried again and again. Suddenly, a distress beeper sounded in front of Donahue. It is a standard device on Federal Protective Service walkie-talkies activated by pressing a button. I haven't really heard of that feature before, and I really appreciate that they would have a device like that, because if they are incapacitated for some reason, if they can't speak into the walkie-talkie, they at least could, just with the press of a button, let their coworkers know something is wrong and send help. Donahue tore out of the library, got into his own cruiser, and checked the area immediately in front of him. Then he headed down the service road that winds to the rear of the building. Once again, pretty much the description we're getting from looking at it on the map. He found Yesucevitz's cruiser at the edge of the grass lawn that separates the building from the seawall. Its doors were open, its lights on. So there we're getting some good description. So essentially he's finding the car. Based on what he's saying, I think we're looking right at it. It's somewhere along this grass edge, because they are mentioning the seawall that separates the water. And if it was along this, that's not the seawall. We know there's more land over on the other side there. So it sounds to me like his cruiser has stopped somewhere around here. And remember, he's 30 feet away from that. 30 feet away on the grass, Donahue found Yesucevitz lying in a pool of blood. He had been shot once in the head. Other police officers arrived at the library at 11:08 p.m. and reported then that one bullet had been fired from Yesucevitz's weapon and that his radio was beneath his body. So we now have two items. We've got his gun supposedly either in his hand or somehow winding up under his body. We have him with the radio also under his body. We know that he hit that button, the distress button essentially on the radio. So it kind of seems reasonable that in one hand he had his gun, in the other hand he had his radio, and he was about to call for help further. And the gunshot happens to the back of his head. He falls forward and lands on both of those items. He was taken to Boston City Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 11:56 p.m. The FBI, which took over the investigation because it occurred on federal territory, refused yesterday to discuss any aspects of the case. And from what I can see, they've pretty much held firm to that. I've seen a few little comments here or there, but it's basically we can't really make comments. I haven't seen any real strong details come out of this. It's really hard to even know about a potential theory with them being so tight-lipped here. Is this a random act? Is this someone that was trying to break into the library? Is this someone that was just doing drugs back there and things got out of hand and it turned into a murder situation? There's a lot of possibilities. We're going to touch on some of them before we end today's, but it's hard to really kind of zone in on what's going on with this case. We do get to know a little bit more about Robert here. Members of Yesucevitz's family described him as a caring and considerate person who enjoyed music. His stereo was his pride and joy, his mother said. She said he loved his car and also liked to chase girls. He really loved police work, his mother said. She said that he had applied for positions on a number of municipal police forces before joining the Federal Protective Service. Yesucevitz had been assigned to the Kennedy Library since it opened. While he was unhappy with the low salary and what he felt were poor prospects for advancement, he rarely discussed it with friends, his family. He didn't complain much, said his father, Michael. In addition to his mother, father, and sister, Yesucevitz leaves two brothers, Michael and James. Just a terrible, terrible tragedy. And from what I understand, they were planning on having a party, basically his going away party for him leaving that job, I believe the day after he was actually shot. So I did find at least some reference to the FBI here. The FBI Wednesday sought clues in the killing of a guard. Authorities found him shot in the back of the head and lying in a pool of blood. Peter Thomas, executive assistant to the regional administrator of the General Services Administration in Boston, said he had no indication that the library was broken into or if Yesucevitz's keys were missing. However, I have no indication that it wasn't either, he said. We don't know anything right now, said Thomas. The GSA and FBI are involved because the library is a federal building. I've seen subsequent reports that are basically saying nothing was stolen. It didn't look like the library was broken into. So once again, it really points us back to what's going on with the motive here. Why would someone kill this man? It's the question for today's case. I still don't have a great idea on the answer. Moving on to another article from newspapers.com. This is from the Daily Advertiser on the 21st of July, 1982. We're still waiting to find out why it happened, said the victim's brother, Michael, also of Brockton. A priest from the Boston Police Department and some officers of the Federal Protective Service came to our house early this morning to tell us what happened. My parents are pretty shaken up by it. He also said his brother's shift usually ended around 11 p.m. So if we don't already have one terrible condition in that he was ending this job soon for good so he could go back to college, we now have this other terrible condition that he was literally almost off his shift for the night, more than likely. On top of that, we have the fact that he was actually worried about working alone. This is from the Boston Globe on July 22nd, 1982. The federal police officer shot to death Tuesday night at the JFK Library recently expressed concern about his safety because staff cutbacks forced him to patrol outside alone at night. I just wanted to stop here and say one of the things that bothered me when I first started looking into this was thinking about that. How often are officers working alone? And what a terrible thing that might be if they do actually face something like we're seeing in this case. Basically, there's only two employees that are working at the JFK Museum at this point. One of them's inside monitoring the closed circuit TV. So if you bump into any kind of serious threat outside of that, you're on your own for a matter of minutes at least. And those minutes can make a big difference. I think that might be the type of situation we're looking at here. Now, admittedly, typically, are you going to see a lot of violence around a museum like that? I don't know. I don't know if it makes sense that you would only have an officer go on patrol on their own for trying to secure that type of facility. But it did change. Apparently, before the cutbacks, they weren't out there alone. So let's learn a little more here. Robert Yesucevitz's mother, Edith, said yesterday that her 26-year-old son had told her working alone made him leery. I just wanted to point it out. It's not a major thing, but I've seen his age range just bounce all over the place. Earlier articles were saying 24. The family member that reached out to me says 25. This article is saying 26, but you get the idea. He worried about it, she said during an interview in her Brockton home yesterday. Yesucevitz lived with his parents on Douglas Road in Brockton. He was in his last week of work as an FPS officer when he died. He had planned to enter Stonehill College in Easton as a journalism major. Last night was to have been his going away party. Just last week, his sister Joyce said yesterday when she tried to convince him to stay on the job he had held for 3 years, he replied, "Yeah, but you could get shot at." Terrible. It's just such a terrible occurrence on so many fronts here. Another detail from the Los Angeles Times. The JFK Library, which opened in 1979, juts into Boston Harbor on Columbia Point in the city's Dorchester section. Nearby is the Columbia Point low-income housing project, much of which is boarded up and abandoned. So I had seen references to it, but I hadn't seen that much detail about it. It sounds like this project was not in good shape at the time that this went down. I'm wondering, in terms of theories here, if that's one that we should consider. almost like we talked about in Greta's case at the start of today's episode. Is this some potential that someone a little on the fringes of society or homeless or something along those lines was around back there, and there was some type of chance encounter, and we're looking at a pure random murder for some reason, which of course would make this very difficult to investigate, very difficult to try to track that person down, to try to get a conviction. If there's no relationship between the murderer and the victim, the investigation is just, it's a really tough thing. It's a whole different type of investigation. So are we looking at that in this situation? Possibly. That's why I wanted to get that description out to you guys and let you know that, that housing project was boarded up and abandoned at that point. Who knows who could have been living there? Who knows what they could have been doing? Maybe they like to do drugs out by the water and they were just a little too close to the library and he was engaging them. Remember, we also have the university talking about the fact that it seemed like someone was kind of skulking around that area as well. I don't know. We've got some indicators pointing potentially to something of that nature. So what did his family member tell me, especially about the theory that for some reason maybe Robert ended his own life, which I appreciate that his family member is even leaving all options open like that. I don't really feel like that situation happened here, especially if he was shot in the back of the head. But here's some more information that might steer us away from that thought. A few things. He was killed 30 minutes before the end of his shift. It was his last week on the job. Returning the following week, he was going to be continuing his education. Here, the family member says it was actually in law enforcement, but in the papers, we're hearing that it's in journalism. I'm not sure. From a standing position, and shooting oneself in the head typically doesn't result in the person falling forward while still holding the weapon, and the gun hand and weapon winding up below the body. But way more important than all that, and this is information that's coming from the family, I can't find official sources for this information. He's telling me the bullet doesn't match the weapon. That effectively Robert's gun is not the same gun that shot him in the head. Very different from what we heard in the article earlier. I would like to think the family is probably getting a little more updated information, even if the FBI isn't being exactly open with them, which he does say in this as well. While the case is still active, the FBI won't share information. He does have another potential theory there. If we jump back to the map real quick, just something that might be at play here. There is a pier, and he had heard some rumors about potentially a boat that, like a drug bust that effectively happened at this pier involving a boat. So could this have been used for trafficking of some kind? Could Robert have bumped into something along those lines? Possibly, and especially if we consider that the bullet in Robert is different than his own revolver. We now have two guns on the scene. I'm curious why we haven't heard about where his shot fired was found. Like, did they notice any bullet holes that were in the building? Did they notice them anywhere in the concrete around? It's possible there's so much open space out there. It's possible that, the gunshot rang out over the ocean and you'd never know if there was the gunshot. You'd never be able to track it again. So there's certainly some potential that there could have been a shot that we can't track. There's some potential that maybe we could have tracked it, but the FBI doesn't want to talk about it. But if what the family member is telling me is true, there's two guns at the scene. And I'm wondering if he pulled out his weapon and he squeezes off around, but he manages to get shot in the back of the head. I'm really wondering if we're looking at a situation where there's more than one person, where effectively he's engaging one person that is in front of him and someone else comes up behind him, something along those lines. If Robert had his own revolver in his hand, I just really can't imagine a scenario where he was forced into a position like for an execution or something of that nature. And a shot to the back of the head kind of sounds like that. So to me, at least from the details we're getting, it sounds like that was some type of surprise attack that was likely happening from someone else. If it is two people, I think, honestly, if nothing else, that might increase our odds that someone out there has some information. Maybe one of those two people or both of those two people have spoken about this. Maybe they've told family about it. Maybe they've bragged about it while they were drunk. I don't know. But for me, from what I'm seeing here, it really feels like the possibility that there's more than one person that he encountered. Moving on to the Boston Globe from the 25th of July, 1982. This is a picture from the funeral for officer. An honor guard of more than 200 police officers and more than 250 mourners attended a funeral service for slain Federal Protective Service officer Robert W. Yesucevitz at St. Coleman's Church in Brockton. Yesucevitz was shot to death Tuesday. And we get a little more detail I want to share with you guys here. Reverend Paul McDonald told Mr. Yesucevitz's family, friends, and coworkers, "We are reminded once more today that the men and women who serve in law enforcement unfortunately make the ultimate sacrifice in the line of duty." He asked them to believe that Robert is not dead. Our faith tells us that the best is yet to come. A squad of 20 motorcycle officers escorted Mr. Yesucevitz's body to Melrose Cemetery in Brockton. More than 50 police cars with flashing blue lights joined the motorcade to the cemetery where he was buried as taps were played. And finally, this is pretty much one of the last articles I could find on this case from almost a year later, the 10th of July, 1983, once again in the Boston Globe. Northeastern University's College of Criminal Justice will offer an endowed scholarship to criminal justice majors beginning with the 83 to 84 academic year. The scholarship honors slain federal police officer Robert W. Yesucevitz and all the police officers killed in the line of duty. And I don't get a chance to say this on the channel too often, but I do want to thank law enforcement out there for everything they do to help keep us safe. I know that we look into a lot of cases where we're wondering if they're doing everything that they can do. It's one of those things that when you hear a story like this, it just kind of tugs at you and kind of brings you back down to earth about what an very, very difficult task they have in terms of trying to keep us safe. And they are going into these situations where they don't know what to expect. And Robert certainly did not know what to expect here. I'm sure he would have called for backup right away, knowing there was police services just a mile away. They could have had a bunch of people descend on that within a matter of minutes. So if you've got law enforcement in your family, give them a big hug. And I just want to thank everyone that was honoring Robert in this way by helping to get this scholarship going, honoring Robert and others that are killed in the line of duty. I want to give a big personal thank you to the family member. I don't know if he wanted me to share his name. That's why I didn't do it in this episode. But I really appreciate that he reached out and he shared these details with me, and that he shared his passion and his love for his fallen family member. It was just very clear to me, and I knew that I had to do something with this case and share it with all of you. So that's why we're here today. And once again, please, please, please share this in the Boston area. Get this video out. There's not a lot of press on this case at all. I had to dig really hard to pull together even the few details that I could get for you guys here today. So you guys can help me by sharing this in that area. Someone in that area, I'm really, really positive of it. Someone in that area has the information. We need that information to come forward. This family deserves it. This man deserves it in terms of honoring his legacy. So I hope you guys will help me get the word out about him. And maybe we can do something to help them find the answers they're looking for. Before I go, I want to thank several new patrons, starting with Miranda Eggleton. Thank you so much, Miranda. She also increased her pledge right after pledging. I really appreciate that. Leslie Appleby, thank you so much. We have Lisa Petsnick also that increased her pledge. Thank you so much, Lisa. I really, really appreciate it. We also have a few donations that came in via PayPal. The first one is from Barbara Jacobson. Thank you, Barbara. I really appreciate it. She also wants to say, I'm sorry that you're having trouble with YouTube. I am too, but I'm so thankful that people like you are out there to help me through all this. And finally, one more, we have a donation from Emily Vastbinder. Thank you so much, Emily. Really, really appreciate it. If you want to contribute, you can visit www.lordandarts.com. There is the PayPal link. There's the Patreon link. There's merchandise you can buy. There's an audiobook that you can buy. All that stuff helps fund me and my work, keeping me here, telling these stories, trying to raise exposure to these cases that are sometimes lost to time, lost to the internet. I really wish DNA was around for this case. This is one of those, if there was some item left behind, I know that they were doing things so differently back then. They weren't considering crime scenes like they are nowadays. They weren't preserving this type of evidence, but that's why we need extra help on this one. I hope you guys will help me with that. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. Please come back on Monday. Brand new episode of 3 Men and a Mystery. We're concluding our talk with criminal behaviorist Sarah Kalin, and we're getting much more into the defense, what their position is in terms of Coley McCraney. You don't want to miss it. That will be here on Monday on the Lord and Arts channel.